The goal is not just bright and shiny wrapping paper, it's sticky wrapping. We want that story to stick with the audience and be shared and move around. Everybody has a life of stories, a career of stories. Not everybody gives those stories credence. Most people discount those stories. And often people are telling stories that aren't theirs. And that can undermine the potency of what's being shared on stage. And those stories can't, again, just be inserted because they're entertaining or tangential to the topic. They really ideally wrap around the big idea, wrap around each of the three key points, and help with the spread.
Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure.
I will live every day as if there were a microphone tucked under my tongue.
It's great to get in the game, but don't get in the game till you understand the rules till you're an insider.
Your life changes when you begin having a different conversation in your head.
What we need to do in radically deep problems is propose radically visionary solutions.
Because the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Julie Masters, and you are listening to another episode of Inside Influence, in which I delve into the minds of some of the world's most fascinating influencers or experts in influence to get to the bottom of what it really takes to own your voice and then amplify it to drive an industry, a conversation, a movement, or a nation. So here's today's question. What makes a breakaway TED Talk? You know, if there's one phenomenon in the world of storytelling that has been impossible to ignore over the last decade, it is this one, the TED Talk. Sometimes inspiring, often igniting, potentially career-defining. Think Simon Sinek, Brene, Amy Cuddy. The TED Talk has become a launching ground for more thought leaders and breakaway ideas than I would say pretty much any other platform. It has also completely rewritten the rules around storytelling and presenting. You think you need an hour to make your point? Think again. Think you need 60 slides to make an impact? Think again. Think you can't change the hearts and minds of millions of people across the globe in under 10 minutes? Think again. To prove that point, TED videos get over 3 billion views annually. 3 billion. And that's not including the views of their videos on other platforms such as YouTube or social media. The most popular TED Talk of all time is by the legendary Sir Ken Robinson, which to date has topped, last time I checked, 72 million views and counting. However, for me, the rise of TED created something else. It created a really interesting question. And that question is, what makes an idea worth spreading? How do you take an idea, a complex set of expertise, years of experience, data, and then distill it down again and again and again until at the end of the process, you have something so simple, so compelling, so action igniting that it has the power to start or fundamentally change a global conversation? And that is the question that led me to our next guest. My guest today is behind some of the most viewed talks in TED history. Devin Marks is the nation's leading TED and TED-style speaking coach. Devin founded the first virtual TED Talk coaching firm, having developed his methodology by researching over years exactly why TED and TEDx talks were so popular. The result was a science-based framework that unpacks, decodes the astounding success of leading talks. His clients range from CEOs, technologists, best-selling authors, veterans, and thought leaders, including Dr. Robert Waldinger, a Harvard researcher who delivered one of the most viral TED Talks in history. It was called What Makes a Good Life? Go check it out. And since its release in 2015, it is now in the TED Top 10 with 40 million views and counting. Collectively, the spread-worthy ideas of Devin's clients have been viewed by hundreds of millions of people around the world. He is also, not slightly incidentally, just an amazing human being. In this storytelling masterclass, we jumped straight into how to find and refine your breakthrough idea. The one sentence description, and it does need to be that simple, that's captivating enough to cut through the noise. The 6 elements of a sticky story, including why texture. I mean, when you think about texture, think about using language that relates to all 5 of your senses. How using texture in our storytelling holds the key to lifting our game from interesting to captivating. The rule of 3. Now, those who are veterans of the podcast, you will have heard this many times in many forms, but here it is again. Why the human brain loves the number 3 when it comes to messaging, and how we can use that to design memorable content. The concept of winnable wins. I've used this so many times in just the couple of weeks that have been since I had this conversation. Basically, why we should never ask for the big change or the big action when we're presenting our ideas, but instead for a small commitment. Essentially an easy win that can be done right now. And finally, beating imposter syndrome. Yep, that old monkey on our back who, given free rein, will often keep, and I have seen it too many times, the most brilliant minds, the most brilliant human beings glued to the sidelines unless we can learn how to harness it. You know, this conversation, it isn't just about building a viral TED Talk, although it contains all the ingredients to do so. This conversation for me is about a new age of storytelling and storytellers. Those with the ability to cut through and build momentum behind their ideas in a world where attention is scarce and getting scarcer and the noise is becoming overwhelming. You know, those individuals that are willing to put their own agenda aside, their own expertise aside, what they want to say aside, and wade through the complexity of their ideas in order to reach the why at the end that will compel us to take action. Basically, those who are committed to making a real impact. And for those of you who are ready to make your own impact and take it to the next level, please don't forget, hop on my website or the show notes and download the latest version of my ebook, The Influencer Code. It covers the 7 areas and the 7 core questions that I actually use in my conversations with world-leading thought leaders, world-leading experts that I have found hands down the most useful when it comes to fast-tracking your influence. Just pop in your email address and it will be in your inbox in the time it takes to make a cup of tea. On that note, sit back, stride out, drive safe, and enjoy the razor-sharp insights of the TED whisperer himself, Devin Marks. Welcome to the podcast, Devin Marks. Great to have you here.
Well, thank you. Really looking forward to getting to know your audience.
I'm really looking forward to getting to know your story and the contents of your head. I'll kick off with a question that I always kick off with, and that is, what's one idea that's having a huge amount of influence on you or your thinking right now? And again, you know, those who listen to the podcast regularly will have heard me say this. It's because those who have great ideas tend to find great ideas. They have a radar for them before the rest of us. And so I'm just fascinated. What's one idea that's really fueling your thinking?
Well, this crystallized for me in the last year in a number of conversations. The big question I've got is, what is the last decade going to be about?
What is the last decade going? Expand for me.
I'm 50-something years old. I have a lineage of Alzheimer's in the family, and early onset could be my reality. And so I've hit pause in my career ambitions and started asking, what's the last decade going to be? And what's been fun as I ask the mentors, the former clients who are really close friends, what their response is to that, a number of times I've heard, wow, I'm wrestling with the same thing, except John Beckett is 83 years old. I had a conversation with Jeremy Connell-Waite, who you would love chatting with someday, at IBM. And he's 50-something and is asking very much that as a father of 2 twins, 6-year-olds, but realizing there's only so much ramp left. And may I be blessed to have 3 decades. But my mother recently passed away with early onset, and her father had, and her grandfather probably did. We didn't call it Alzheimer's back then. So I'm planning on a decade ahead and really beginning to position a lot in my career and family and outside priorities to zone in on that.
That is just a beautiful and profound train of thought, really. And it reminds me of, have you read 4,000 Weeks by Oliver Burkeman?
I should, it sounds like.
It's a similar thought train, which is, if this is the period that I have, it's obviously finite. If this is the period that I have, how would I, rather than unconsciously kind of tripping through it,
Mm-hmm.
How do I consciously design it?
Right.
What do I want? And not from the period of how much do I jam into it, but from a very different place. How do I want it to feel? How do I want to feel? How do I want my family to feel in relation to me? Where is that thought train taking you at the moment, if you don't mind me asking?
Well, the conversation continues, really. I shared with somebody recently, this vision and understanding of what's next is forming storming, and we're not in the norming space yet, but it's very much informed by the experience of my great-grandfather, great-great-grandfather, great-great-uncle. I'm a bit of a student of family history and American commerce. And there was a day I wandered into my grandmother's attic in Kentucky, and I became the keeper of the pile of papers and junk and letters and glue.
That's such a great title. I became the keeper
Yeah,
of the
yeah.
pile. I think that's how a lot of people feel in that
Yeah,
moment.
and one of the treasures up there was 1,700 letters written to my great grandfather, 1884 to the Great Depression, and by his parents who traveled the world and wrote their young boy, who was significantly younger than his siblings, who was in the care of nannies and boarding school, wrote him a letter every day that they were gone, and they traveled at one point 6 months, many around the world, and all these letters I put in sequential order, and then began a study of a life well lived. Now, mind you, short lived because he died early. But a life well lived and a life of significance. But a mentor of mine said, Devin, that path isn't survival, success, significance. It doesn't stop there. The next level is surrender. Surrender to ego, surrender to self, surrender to, and I saw a lot of surrender, conscious attempts at surrender in DeLoss's life and the lives of his older uncles, who really were significant players in American commerce in the industrial age. And they founded the first Dow Industrial Average stock of 13, U.S. leather. And which sounds really exciting because U.S. steel is a big deal, but U.S. leather had the distinction of being the first Dow Industrial Average stock to go bankrupt. So, in that story, there's a lot. And as they asked, what is it all about? That leaning into significant surrender space really resonated in letters and journals, in margin notes of books, and all of that was the archive that I inherited.
And so that shift from significance to surrender, which it's really fascinating to me. This podcast is about a lot of topics. We talk about the three main buckets of influence: how you influence yourself, how you influence one-to-one, and how you influence one-to-many. And yet for this past year, every single conversation seems to have touched on this space, which is the moment in between. Some people call it the wilderness, some people call it the fertile void. Some people just call it that I don't know what's coming next, and I'm still just trying to surrender to letting the universe speak to me rather than constantly trying to talk over it. And it doesn't matter the background and it doesn't matter the accomplishments, but everybody I'm speaking to seems to somehow be in this space. What are some of the, I don't want to say practices, but what are some of the things that you're doing in your daily life to help you move through that with some form of grace? Because it's a period of time that you can easily resist.
Good question. So this is a pre-COVID habit, but it is really a cornerstone of my week year after year. I practice something called Thinker Thursdays. And so on Thursday, I uncouple from the workload and shut myself off with a real book. So dog-eared pages and margin notes.
Are we talking paper here?
Yeah, right,
actual physical paper.
Yep. Physical paper as in writing, and then conversation. So, the read, connect, reflect theme. But all of that is about margin and slowing down. And it was something I adopted again pre-COVID, and then in COVID it adapted because we weren't having face-to-face 2-hour martini lunches anymore. But that time in the work week, uncoupled from the distraction, really allowed me to deeply think about certain things more often than I did usually. How many of us really structure returning to a topic again and again and again, in writing, in conversation, in reading? You know, that's one. That's one way I've been approaching that final decade, maybe.
And I love that frame there. How many of us return to the same question over and over again? Like, if it's a fundamental enough question, how many of us schedule time to sit with it? And not sit with it with attachment of having to answer it as well, because that's easy to do, right? You sit there and just beat yourself up about the fact that you don't have the answer
Right.
yet. But just sit there and let something speak to you, be it by reading, be it in conversation, be it just in thought. Well, I could sit in this place with you all day because this is a conversation. Feels like, honestly, genuinely, it feels like a conversation that is having me at the moment, as opposed to one. I go into these episodes with a conversation that I am, planning to have, and this is a conversation that just keeps having me at the moment, and by proxy, everybody who listens to this podcast.
COVID effect.
The COVID effect. It could well be. It could well be. I want to talk a little bit about you and your life, and as I said, the contents of your head. So you started out as a seminary graduate, or
seminary dropout,
close to a seminary dropout. I had dropout here. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what the research that we found had said. But it fits with something that I have been thinking about for a while, and that is, I've been in the speaking industry for 20 years, and I started out working as an agent. I started my management company, and so I have managed, coached, worked with professional speakers for a very long time. And I had this secret theory, and it was very secret. I think this is the first time I've really talked about it, that those who excelled, who were at the top of their game, who just seemed to be in one way naturals with the concept of getting up there and sharing their ideas in a compelling way, all seem to have a background in having attended churches or religious institutions frequently as children. And it got me thinking, and I was like, well, of course, because week after week after week, you show up and you watch somebody at the front of that room tell stories that changed hearts and minds, and you're trained for it. And so that's my theory, and I wanted to put it to you. Does that feel true for you? Did that background impact you?
Actually, it played out pretty clearly and cleanly. The backstory, how does one become a TED speaker coach or a TED style coach? Everybody's got.
Oh, you didn't just do a course at college on how to become a TED speaker coach?
I was, the Great American Recession, I was splatted face into the pavement and back home, licking my wounds in a 2-street light town, a company town where Methodist ministers are trained. There's Asbury College on one side of the street, now university, and Asbury Seminary on the other side of the street. That was my father's path, my grandfather's path, my great-grand, all the way back to the founding of those institutions. And when I was beginning to ask, what is going on with these lectures that are explosively popular, TED Talks, um, where can I deconstruct this? Seminary was the answer because you're not going to, enroll in business school and figure that out. And, traditional oration is not the space. Um, the independent study in a communications program. I came out of the number one, two, or three communications program in the U.S., the Newhouse School at Syracuse University, and I knew that was not the place because when I spoke to professors and alumni over there, some of them hadn't even heard of TED. So this is 2008, 9. Um, TEDx exploded on the scene in 2009, and so it's pretty early. And I found one professor across the street who said, "I think we can do something with that because isn't that really um, what we've been doing here all along? An idea that spreads, is shared, and changes lives, right?" Um, Then it gets really funny, right? So one day I'm walking Main Street on this little town on a Sunday, supposedly going to church, which I hadn't been to in far too long. Couldn't even remember what time it was. And my mother who I mentioned, suffered from Alzheimer's. This is earlier on in her path, but she had kind of forgotten what time church started too. And we're in this little two street light town, 5 minutes away from the front stoop, and the doors are locked. It was 8:30, not 9 o'clock. Nothing was happening in town, and there were no cars on the street. Nothing, no one out and about until I turned to go home, and I looked up the hill, and a lone character was walking down the other side of the street. Distinguished, tall, older gentleman, white hair, white beard. And as he got closer and closer, he zoned in on us, and he said, "Would you like a tour of this town?" you know, and my mother, her social graces were starting to get challenged there. She bristled, tightened her back and said, "This is my town. I know it." And I immediately, to kind of smooth over this awkward moment, walked right into the middle of the street, and this older fellow walked towards me, and we met in the middle, and a conversation started. And that conversation was one that changed my life over the next year and a half as it continued. Lyman Coleman was a publisher, a best-selling author, a theologian, a pastor, this, that, and the other. But some of his backstory was he had been the lackey and the driver for Billy Graham, and he married Billy Graham's secretary. And over time, he was the young guy on the team, so he did the youth programming and the follow up after the crusade blew through town, and created a specialty in small group dynamics. It really is considered the grandfather of small groups in the church in the U.S. And when I showed him TED, and he watched his first TED talk, I think it was Sir Ken probably. He said, "Well, that's what Billy was doing back in his day." And I was like, "Billy?" Well, I'm not on a first name, with Reverend Graham, but Lyman was. And he said, Billy was clearly focused in his message. His messages were story wrapped, the biblical narrative, but also the personal. And there was a call to action that was igniting and doable now, immediately, not next week, next month. And television was new in his day. For TED, a clearly focused story wrapped action igniting message is table ante for the successful talks. But what was new for TED was social media and YouTube. And so, yes, that's a long way of maybe circling back to there is a huge overlap in the what I call the secular church of ideas, TED, and Sunday morning sermons with good preachers, not the bad ones.
But also exposure.
Exposure.
How exposed we are to compelling ideas now, how exposed we are to people who have the ability to deliver them in a heartfelt, intentional, very deliberate way. And I often think as a parent, how wired my children will be. Unlike, I don't know about you, but when someone asked me to speak in front of a group when I was a kid, I would have rather just stripped down to my underpants and done a lap around the field. But, with this, the power of exposure, the power of seeing it in action. And I also think it's worth talking about the phenomenon that is TED. It's before TED, you could speak to a room of hundreds. You could maybe speak to a room of thousands, maybe. But it was very rare and unusual to have a platform that could reach millions of people. And, some of the stats I have here, TED has the TED Talks, so the collection of talks, 3 billion views annually. Sir Ken Robinson, who you mentioned, who I love, his talk is, I think, at the highest viewage, which is 72 million views. That was before TED, that was unthinkable, completely unprecedented. What is it about TED, do you think? And we'll get into what makes a compelling TED Talk in a second, but what is it about the concept of TED that completely changed the game?
Well, the long answer is I isolated 7 factors in my seminary independent study track that explain why TED is not a keynote, is not a sermon, is not a sales pitch, a funding pitch, that it's a very different beast. Everyone thinks of immediately the countdown clock. And of course, that's one of the 7 factors. In seminary, I was able to add an academic rigor to what was a pet project, right? And I had the opportunity to compare and contrast TED and TEDx with some other short talk conferences that distinguished themselves in the day by using a countdown clock. One was the Idea Festival right up the road in Louisville, Kentucky Derby land. IF was the acronym. Brilliant gathering, very TED-like in its lighting and its stadium or a theater kind of environment. The minimal PowerPoint, kind of all those factors. And then the Idea Festival has died. It didn't replicate past 10 years. But the other factor of comparison was a Christian conference called Q for question. Now, Q, of course, is an unfortunate consonant these days in the US, but the Q conference, Q Ideas, was very TED, just blue light washing over the audience, and a countdown clock and dramatic theater environment. They innovated on the TED model in that they had a countdown clock facing the speaker, but also facing the audience to hold the speaker accountable. In comparing and contrasting, a Q talk, even today, maybe 5,000 views would be a breakaway Q talk. The Idea Festival, 3,000 views would be a breakaway, but all 3 look the same at the surface level. So there's definitely more going on than a countdown clock and dramatic lighting, right? The theater environment is not the distinguishing factor. It's the combination of 7 factors, 3 of which, we'll speak to probably today. A TED Talk is distinctly and uniquely focused in a special way. Story wrapped. The points and the big idea are story wrapped. It's not insert story for opening, insert story for close, emotional, but. And then thirdly, action igniting. And I say, a TED Talk is not, this is very sermon-like. A TED Talk is not boil the ocean, save the whales, save the ozone layer. It's a call to action that's much smaller than that. It's very much like a Billy Graham sermon. Take one small step right now that is in the direction of life change. It's a winnable win. It's a small step in the direction of the seashore, right? I say symbolically, I walk with my daughter hand in hand to the water's edge, and I see a piece of trash, and I invite her to pick it up. And then I pick up the next piece, and she picks up a piece. But down the shoreline, somebody sees us picking up trash, and they replicate that. They share that. It even becomes a habit. And if the call to action in a TED context is that, that's spreadable.
Two things I picked out there from what you said. The importance of finite time, to have a finite period of time, which is not something I had thought about before, but by having a finite period of time, it forces you to get absolutely crystal clear. And the other one, as you said, is the winnable wins, like small winnable wins. Like, what are you going to finish with? What can you give me as one step forward? Not an overwhelming step, not change the world, not reinvent your entire life, but what is a small winnable win that you can give me that's going to point me in the right direction? Since then, since you being at seminary school and deconstructing TED Talks, I know that you have, you've worked with some of the best TED speakers on the planet, coaching them to take them and their idea onto TED stages and ignite an idea that eventually goes viral. I want to talk about that first conversation. I just want to just boil it down into when you first meet somebody, when somebody first inquires about working with you, and I'm sure it's not easy to get to work with you. What questions do you ask in that first conversation? What are some of the key points that you need to know in order to craft an incredible talk?
Well, the first thing I'm looking for is just their idea in the midst of what's usually a lot of ideas or many, many weaves on ideas. I say, there's a splay above every speaker's head of Post-it notes. And I had a discovery call literally today with a remarkable woman who has an adventure story and experience in her recent past. But she started talking about the theme of patience in a way that I hadn't heard before. And that got my attention, and I wanted to learn a little bit more. So we started pulling at that thread. Now, this, first conversation, sometimes second, third conversation, it's still emerging. There are other times the speaker shows up, they've got the through line, they've got the 100-word version, they've got often those talks go through a full retread, because the reality is the idea isn't TED ready. It's TED like. I took my Dale Carnegie chops. I took my public speaking norm, and I applied it to TED, and I have a 15-minute talk. But those models of idea sharing and spreading are not, well, the TED spread effect. The effect is not the same. There's actually never been a Toastmaster champion with a million view talk to date. Why?
And that's fascinating.
Right. It's very much because they're approaching idea sharing and spreading in the traditional model. And TED broke a lot of those models, took a lot of the communication tools out of the tool shed and reworked them, threw a couple away, and architected a couple new ones. So there's a lot that's very familiar in preparing a TED talk, a lot of steps. I always say we move through 4 phases: idea to outline. Milling that idea is a 6-step process, and it can take weeks. We may make our way down to the 4th step and find, as we begin to share and get feedback, that the idea really isn't TED ready. And we go to another Post-it note and start the milling process all over again. But phase 2, idea to outline to script to rehearsals to stage craft. Those all sound familiar. Those all sound like, Public Speaking 101, Dale Carnegie meets Toastmasters. But each of those steps and terms are different in the TED context. One little example, right? What am I talking about? We have a script, we have, a deck to build maybe. And so it's not open PowerPoint and open Microsoft Word. It was a dark and stormy night. big idea. Key point 1, 2, 3, rousing story and call to action and bring them to their feet. I mean, the talk may flow like that, but where I begin with my clients, and I think this is one of my distinguishing, approaches, is we start one with a big idea, and then we go right into the core of the script. What's key point 1? What's key point 2? Do we need a third, a fourth? If there are 5, is there an acronym? Because the rule of 3 is dominant in the TED space. But we need to get those 3 so they interrelate, lock, and move the idea forward, as opposed to just kind of off kilter support the big idea. And that energy and time is where we spend the bulk of module 2, that scripting module. Once we have key point 1, 2, and 3 maybe ironed out, then we ask ourselves, what's the opening? Because how many minutes do we have left? We did our heavy work in the middle, in the core of the message. How much time do we have to close? Now, I say, all right, we've got that done. Let's go to the opening or let's go to the close, your choice.
You mentioned through line as well there, and you touched on it very briefly, but I think it's worth going to. When you say through line, because the through line is something that's talked about a lot when it comes to putting together compelling ideas. Talk to me about what your version of the through line, what it means for you.
Yeah, there's a lot of terminology floating. The through line, the big idea. A friend of mine calls it the red thread. Another, the silver bullet. We're talking about the takeaway, big idea, right? And a good example is one of my clients, Dr. Robert Waldinger. He's a Harvard researcher who explores health and happiness in the lives of men and families. One of the most viral talks of all time in TED land, a top 10 all-time talk, 42 million views. Yes, Sir Ken Robinson is ticking in the 70, 80 million. He's been at it over 15 years or something now. Dr. Waldinger is about half that. So an explosively viral talk. The through line, the good life is built with good relationships. Now, he's looking at a longitudinal study of health and happiness in the lives of men. Every facet of a man's life was measured and weighed and compared and contrasted over 75 years. It's the largest data set of its kind in the world. The good life is built with good relationships. So I want to know a little bit about the good life. How do you build it? And what are good relationships? Do you get the alliteration too? There's a rhythm to it, a balance to it. Undergirding that big idea, in his case, with 3 points. And again, there can be more than 3, and that's where an acronym comes in handy sometimes. But undergirding that big idea with 3 points, we want those, again, to be balanced. Think architecturally. I talk about the message temple, right? The big idea is the roof of the dome, and you've got 3 pillars supporting it. They've got to be the same height, the same density, the same width. But they also need to, as we said before, interlock and move that idea forward. Move that audience to action. And in this case, that through line sets up the movement that's going to come.
And there's mastery to that simplicity as well. And I think that that's worth underlining, because often we hear things and we think, well, it sounds really simple. Of course, of course, a great life is really depends on our relationships, but there is mastery to simplicity. You've got, especially if you've been studying something for decades, the amount of complexity that you have to wade through in order to get to a place of that much profound simplicity. And honestly, I work with speakers who have been doing it for decades. And even they struggle when they've, become fascinated with the next big idea, they're writing the book, even they struggle to encapsulate all of their thoughts and all of their outcomes into one compelling sentence. How do you lead people through that? How do you kind of take their hand when they're in the midst of the complexity of their experiences and their ideas to pull them towards profound simplicity?
Well, it's very much a milling process, and I don't use that term as just a holding. We are milling flour, right? Finer, finer, finer. And so too often a speaker hears, oh, I need a silver bullet and I need a 7-word through line or whatnot. There are a number of ways to approach that line. And I'm not saying my method is the only one by any stretch, but what I like to do is begin with that splay of ideas and then get it into, say, 400 words. And those are 400 loosey goosey, still forming, storming words. And then we begin shaving it down, 200 words, 100 words. Now, a lot of people are sharp and they go, okay, well, I'm going to just skip forward to 50 and drill from there. But no, what we're doing as we move from a 400 word expression to a 200 to a 100 to a 50 to a 25 to a is we're beginning to lay down a pattern of information sharing that is full of clues. And I, as a speaker coach, can come alongside that thought leader who's awash in expertise and detail and start to see perhaps the 3 key points glowing. Or I talk about, I see a bread trail and I start asking, tell me about this. The other thing that's useful in that model of willowing down to the through line. Now there are 3 or 4 other activities. There's the focus, circle feedback rounds. There's the compare and contrast, what talks are out there on this topic, et cetera, et cetera. But that 6-step model, what is also useful is beginning to wrestle what should and shouldn't be in the talk with those different expressions, and also identify, oh, wow, that's not wasted copy. The 400, the 200, that's going to probably be a social media post later. Because, when you step off stage, another whole workload begins as a speaker propelling an idea. Now, the top 10 talks, don't all have a clear and delineated through line like that. Top 25 don't. But, Amy Cuddy, power posing. Now, some people quibble with the research, and there's a little bit of, she's one of the few TEDsters with an asterisk, that says this is contentious. These are findings that are worth digging into for yourself. But that to the side, your body language shapes who you are. Through line. Simon Sinek, we've probably all seen his talk 11 times or more. People don't buy what you do. They buy why you do it. Now, interestingly, you have a through line and you start testing it and you start feedbacking it and you start asking, is it sticky? What was it? And sometimes you're going to have to retread. And then the question is, once you've got that through line that an audience of 1 or 100 is resonating with, because there's a lot of rehearsal live and feedback loops that happen in prepping a talk, how are we going to use that in the script? Dr. Waldinger's talk culminates in the through line. He doesn't repeat it once. It's stated once. Simon Sinek repeats his through line 6 times. Both are top 10 talks. Both have, ripple effect in clarity, but, it's, there are 2 ways to approach it, a number of ways to approach it. So, my willowing down is not the only way to a through line, and use of the through line one time is not the only way to make use of it in a talk. And that's the joy and variety of, the TED ideas that don't all follow that same, it was a dark and stormy night structure.
But the through line of the through line is that you need to have one.
Yes,
it needs to be there.
I agree.
Now I want to talk about story, because we start off with expertise. We start off with decades of experience and a lot of ideas in my head. Post-it notes, a wall of post-it notes. And then the whittling down, the finding of the through line. And then you use this beautiful terminology, which I love, which is story wrapped. Then we've got to take that and we have to wrap it in story. Story is the vehicle. Story is what's going to make it travel at speed, go viral. So Talk to me about how you start to find the right stories, the right wrapping for this idea.
Well, the goal is not just bright and shiny wrapping paper. It's sticky wrapping. We want that story to stick with the audience and be shared and move around. And there are, a number of shapes or forms of story. Nancy Duarte, who you've had on, speaks to this in her latest book, The Shape of Story, and she highlights Kurt Vonnegut's theorizing around story shape. And she's spot on. He was spot on. And I incorporated his insight in my first training 7 years ago. Um, the classic shape of story is man walks along, falls in a hole, gets out of the hole, continues, right? You see the shape there. The setup, the problem, the resolution, 3-act structure, basic story shape stuff. But Kurt Vonnegut hazarded there were many other shapes of story. And then researchers came along and in aggregate looked at stories and whether it was Google Books or whatnot, and they began to discern their 6 patterns. What are the 6 classic shapes of story? Well, that's all very interesting, but what I care most about is what's the stickiest form, not what are 3 or 4 other shapes of story. What is the stickiest form? And that is that highly concentrated hero's journey, right? Man walks along, falls in a hole, gets out of a hole, continues. Everybody has a life of stories, a career of stories. Not everybody gives those stories credence. Most people discount those stories. And often people are telling stories that aren't theirs. And that can undermine the potency of what's being shared on stage in the TED or the TED style context. And, it's worth noting TED has redefined how we share and spread ideas. You cannot give a keynote and not be compared to Simon Sinek and Brene Brown and all the big TEDsters. You cannot deliver a sermon and not be compared to a TED talk I saw last night that really touched me, Pastor. You cannot even, pitch a startup and not be compared to the TED model of communications. And stories, sticky stories in particular, are a potent central factor. And those stories can't, again, just be inserted because they're entertaining or tangential to the topic. They really ideally wrap around the big idea, wrap around each of the 3 key points, and help with the spread.
There's 2 things that you said there. One is that it's not always the obvious ones, which was a question I was going to ask you, because I often find that when you hear a speech for the first time, someone's practicing a speech, or you're reviewing a speech, and the stories that they choose, they're just not quite, as you said, they're not personal. You can't feel them. They don't have that kind of grippingly human quality to them. And it's not until you have a conversation with that person about, tell me about this. What is it? Why does this touch you so much? Where does this come from? What resonates with you the most, and why and when? It's not until you have those conversations that all of a sudden a story comes out that they don't necessarily want to share because it's personal. It means a lot. And those are the stories where you're like, that's what we need to, not necessarily what we need to hear, but that's what we need to feel. That's you in a space that we need to feel in order for this to become sticky. Do you find that? Do you find that the stories that people need to tell are usually not the most obvious ones, or the ones that they want to tell?
I think I'm very visual, and it always helps my clients when we're talking about stories. There's some, overlaps here. Who is the audience, right? That's one. Outside of the TED context, it's not always a general audience, and that's the TED audience. But there's the audience we're speaking to. What are their priorities, goals, hopes, whatever. There's also, so our stories need to relate to that audience, be relatable. But I say visually because picture a bullseye. The center of the bullseye is your personal life experience, career experience story. That's the most potent, gripping, you know, pulse speeding form of story. I'm going to lean in as you say, let me tell you a story. I was. The next radiating circle in that bullseye pattern is the story of someone I personally know. The next radiating story, the next radiating story, the next radiating story is Abraham Lincoln and the Wright brothers. We don't know them. And so what happens when you're sharing the story of famous and distant VIPs, there dissonance happens. And my understanding of who Abraham Lincoln was is very different probably from yours. And there's a little bit of tension and clash. And as the audience is wrestling with those versions, even subconsciously, the bonding and movement together we're looking to build, the momentum we're looking to build in the talk, begins to, fade. Or there's dissonance there that begins to break the momentum. And so leaning into a personal first person or that second radiating circle story is always a great place to start. But then, as you said, we need to sort out the TMIs and the, personal but not relevant. Again, we're looking for a story wrapped story.
Yeah. There is a difference between intentional and authentic.
Yeah.
And I'd far rather someone be intentional about what they share as opposed to sweepingly authentic with what they share. What are some of the questions you ask the people you work with to try and pull out these stories, these bullseye or close to the bullseye stories?
Well, kind of the opening conversation is usually, take me from grade school to the present and take as much time as you need. Well, I mean, where are they going to detour? That's where their heart and interest lies. Where are they going to stall? Is it college? Was it the first job? Was it the first divorce? Was it all of these potential stories and detours are rich. And if the idea has been milled enough that we have an inkling what it's going to be, again, recent conversation today, it's around patience. And she has a very different understanding of what the value of patience and what it can mean to achieving a goal. Well, if patience is the identified theme and possible the through line's going to come out of that, where in her tale is the win going to be? Oh, that was patience driven win.
So again, starting with a through line and then going through and picking out where does that through line most pop up in my experiences.
Yeah, I take clients through the idea mill process in a cohort model. There's a course option, there's a cohort option, then there's the one-on-one thing. And but I love the big idea mill cohort over 5 weeks of content and workshopping, because those through lines are shaky at first, but then more and more clear as you move into the week 3-4 space. Then we take a pause in week 4, and they begin to shop that around to their circle of trust and begin to get feedback outside of our little bubble. And then we reconvene. And then that informs everything that comes forward, in scripting and rehearsals and adapting, and then much less stage.
Talk to me about the rule of 3. You mentioned it briefly. I know it's not the only structure, however, it is a very prevalent structure. I was talking to Cuddy, who's Barack Obama's speechwriter, and even he was saying, the cadence of 3, there is something very powerful about having, a powerful introduction and then 3 key points. Have you found that to be so? Is 3 the magic number when it comes to the amount of points that people can not only digest, but spread to their inner circle?
We're not going to remember 5, 7, and 11 points. And, not to return to church, but the sermon that most powerfully lands is, in homiletics. That's the fancy Greek word for preaching, right? One of the old lines was a big idea, 3 points, in a poem. Now, this is 1950, right? Back when poetry was going to be part of the mix. But these days, it's a story. And I think there's a lot to the reality that moving an idea that's focused around 3 points, that is story sticky, that engages us more than anything, any model. The rule of three, three little pigs, three wise men. I came, I saw, I conquered. Father, Son, Holy Ghost. It goes on and on. It is it is the pulse and current of our culture and idea sharing. And so defaulting to that is one of the things Ted did very early on, and seems to be working.
I've had this conversation in so many different forms, the power of the rule of three, and yet I have never been able to find so far the neuroscience or any kind of academia that backs up why the number three is so powerful for us. But it just is. It is. And as you said, through the ages, through the centuries, the power of three has come back over and over again. And why it is so compelling to the human mind, I do not know. But it's worth knowing that it just is. And use it. Do not question it. If I ever come across any concrete evidence, I will unearth it. But it's definitely one. It's definitely one to use. Some of the other ones, and I know you've got your sticky story structure, which I loved, by the way. Some of those we've already touched on, such as you need a structure. You need to have a structure. Things like the rule of three, you need a compelling beginning. Textured, I loved. That's one of those. Textured. What do you mean when you say the word textured?
So you've done some research and digging. Good for you. I usually hold back on the sticky story model. Six parts, in my estimation, make for a sticky story. So sure, let's dig into that. A sticky story. You're right. First, it's structured. Second, it's textured. So the toilet was leaking. The plumber showed up and asked me to stand out of the way, but I wanted to watch with my daughter because I'd like her to know the basics of plumbing someday. And as he reached around, bending to get the back pipe, that classic plumber's butt and butt cheek, hot, hot day, a little bit of sweat dribbling down. All right, that's all the texture we need, but it's very visceral, and you just need 2 or 3 little visuals that fit in the context of what you're sharing, um, to have, to check the textured box, if you will, right? Um, if you recall, that lone sentinel coming down Main Street was tall, white haired, white beard, and if we spent some time thinking about that story being central to the opening, I would have talked about his eyes because they were very different, blue and sparked and soft. Somebody's seeing Lyman right now and they've never met him. That's all you need for texture.
But also something else just happened in that moment. And I don't know if it happened for everybody that's listening, but you changed. And I can see you, so that's an added layer. But you changed in that moment. When you were telling that story with that amount of depth, I could feel how you felt in that moment, looking into those eyes. Your energy, your state, your entire being changed. And I think that is a secondary power to textured. On the one hand, you involve all your senses. What could you smell? What could you hear? What could you taste? What was happening? How did it feel? But there's something about telling a textured story that pushes us into a state that is absolutely spellbinding. Like your whole body changed when you told that version, the textured version of that story.
And to go back to one principle we spoke to earlier, that was the center of the bullseye story.
Mm. Mm.
One of my most intimate relationships began in that moment of exchange in the middle of the street.
Mm.
So there's something even virtually that's communicated subconsciously to an audience. That visceral energy that we just felt is present in Brene Brown's telling, in Simon Sinek's stories, even though they're not his personal stories. There's just something special happening there that is magical, but designed.
Magical but designed. Beautiful and yet clearly intentional. An incredible speaker and one of my favorite human beings on the planet, a guy called Tim Gard. He has this amazing phrase. He says, well, you don't tell and retell a story. You live and you relive a story. And
I love that.
Yeah, isn't that amazing? And that's the difference. That's the adding of the texture. You move out of telling it and you move into reliving it. And we can feel the difference.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to go on to another point of this kind of sticky story framework. Another one that I loved, kid leveled. Now, I'd never heard it called kid leveled before.
We were contorting an acronym, but yeah,
it works. It works. I mean, actually, I'm not going to describe it. What does kid leveled mean?
simplicity. We want clean, simple language, 6th grade level. I always tell my clients, I work with a lot of PhDs and, the thought leaders with a lot of letters behind their names. And so often the script has far too many syllables and far too many difficult words. I want Hemingway, not Hawthorne. And those two American writers could not be more different. Hawthorne's florid and long-winded, and Hemingway's short, clean, and crisp. So those 6th grade words and sentences are crisp, clean, and clear. Kid leveled.
Yeah. What are some of your favorite stories from TED? That if somebody was listening and wanted to go and check them out, as this is a classic example of an incredibly sticky story.
I use this example all the time. He's not a client of mine, but I ever so much admire this story. There are two that are a great contrast. One is by Sean Aker, and he tells the story of nap time with his sister. And falling out of the bunk beds, breaking her arm, and she's a unicorn. So that's a very short 2-minute, 90-second, 2-minute challenge shaped story. Another is the Dirty Jobs Mike Rowe, and he has a 17-minute talk that runs about 12 minutes of one story. It's the castration of sheep story. And, he's the Dirty Jobs guy. He's highly entertaining. And in this message about the dignity and importance of dirty jobs, he shares this farm experience, and it's hysterical. The shape is the same as Sean Akers. The shape is the same as man walks, falls in hole, gets out of hole.
What are some of the core mistakes? We've gone through structure, we've gone through through line, we've gone through stories. Let's just go to the negative for a second. If the best that you can do is just avoid these factors, what are the factors to avoid?
Well, TED has the 10 Commandments, and any speaker who's not well versed in those is about to make a big mistake. And then scratch their head and wonder why they're one of the hundreds of thousands of TEDxers on YouTube not being watched and whose ideas are not spreading. And they're as mundane as don't sell from stage, and as nuanced as serve your audience. This message is a presentation, a present to your audience. Chris Anderson says, the head of TED. I think the selfishness of a speaker drawn to the TED community because they want to be viral really impacts the potential that they're going to experience in the TEDx space. They're either going to be washed out of a top tier talk event and find their way to a bottom tier event that's just going to scrape speakers in because they're figuring out the first year, the second year. And what's sad there is not only are they selling themselves and their book or their consulting services or their genius, but they're completely forgetting the service to the audience that's so important. Those are a few that pop to mind. And it's so easy to get jazzed about the million views, the viral. I try not to use the word viral too often because there's a little bit of magic in there that you can't game. But the certainty is if a talk's not clearly focused, if we've been talking about story wrapped in action igniting, that's table ante right there. And then we start layering in some of these other factors that we've touched on or that we haven't. What is a rehearsal flurry as opposed to a practice session, as opposed to a round robin feedback loop? I mean, all of that nuance. So, here's one that in your former line of work, you probably can resonate with. It's that big brand speaker, multi-bestseller who contacts me and says, you know what? I've got the talk. I don't need any help with the talk. Can you connect me with the decision makers at TED? And, one, I'm not an agent. Two, you probably don't have the talk because you didn't come at this at the most basic level of idea milling and testing and focus grouping and vulnerability. You came at this with all the answers. And I rarely see that posture translate well on screen.
Because as you said, there's a disconnect there between
Right.
the intention,
Right.
the intention of what you're trying to do versus your own intention, your agenda behind doing it. My last question for you is, it's a question that I get asked a lot, and honestly, I don't know that I ever come up with a good enough answer, but I've tried to answer it in a variety of different ways. And that is this question of imposter syndrome. People who have
huge in the land of TED.
Incredible ideas. Some of the most incredible, compelling human beings with the most incredible, compelling ideas I see left on the sidelines because of this one phenomenon of, who do I think I am? Who do I think I am to share this? And the fear of somebody else asking us, who do you think you are, to step up there and say what you have to say. What is there a piece of guidance that you give people who may be struggling with the question, either who do you think you are or imposter syndrome?
Again, this conversation today with a possible TEDx speaker, she said, I've heard from 4 or 5 people in the last month since she accomplished this huge physical feat. As I talked with them, you need to give a TED Talk. And so people are asking and affirming that there's something there. And then I have a conversation with them, and more often than not, I'll see something there and affirm it. And then my role is that of a Sherpa, right? I come alongside that thought leader, that speaker, that maybe not yet, but maybe I could be individual who's doubting, who's second guessing and is fearful. And I begin affirming, you can get across that crevasse. That ladder is safe. Let's pitch the tent here out of the wind, but in the sun. because I've been up and down this Mount Everest so many times. I know there are a number of ways and techniques within certain boundaries to bring that idea to stage. And I over time can build a sense of trust with that speaker, and they begin believing in themselves. And then the power and potency of this model of idea preparing to spread, right, is it's very open source. The practices that happen in front of live audiences before you end up in the TED theater environment are vulnerable, but they're also affirming. And that confidence can build over time as they go from idea to center stage.
I love that idea of a Sherpa. I just think I'm gonna take that and I'm gonna run with that. To find yourself a Sherpa, someone who has walked the road, someone who knows the pitfalls, someone who sees in you what at that point you may or may not see for yourself, and who can decode the road forward for you. Find that Sherpa and stick with them. Yeah, I'm gonna take that one on board myself. Well, Devin, thank you so much for
Julie, thank
your
you.
time and for sticking with seminary school long enough to decode something that has gone on to contribute so much to so many people, bringing ideas out into the world that are truly worth spreading. So thank you.
Well, I hope it's been of service to your audience. I hope someone found this helpful and useful. And to continue the conversation, there's a tool that we share on connecttocompelnow.com, and it unpacks these 3 points and pairs them with different TED Talks. And it's really instructive and helpful that way, and might be a conversation starter one day.
Perfect. Well, we'll get the link from that, and we'll get it in the show notes for anyone that's listening. Jump on. I mean, seeing it in action is the best way. Is the best way to learn. Thank you again, Devin.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode and have seized hold of at least one tool, idea, or mindset that will help you start raising your own level of influence. Now, for those of you who want to take the next step in your journey or would just love a roadmap to becoming the most influential voice, idea, or brand in your space, then I have good news. You can now download the latest updated version of my ebook, The Influencer Code, from my website, juliemasters.com. Also, there's a link in the show notes. Just pop in your email address, and I promise I will not spam you, but it is jam-packed full of ideas, tools, and case studies that I have come across in my now 20 plus years of doing this work. Not to mention the 7 areas and 7 core questions that I have found to be hands down the most valuable when it comes to immediately lifting your ability to make an impact. Download it, keep it, share it, juice it for all it is worth. I hope it makes a massive difference in both your career and your business. Thank you always to my co-founder and the main brain behind this podcast, Lauren Kelly. You kick my butt in all the right ways. Thank you for making it happen. And if you did enjoy the show, then we would love you to share this podcast and leave us a review on iTunes, Google, Stitcher, whatever your platform of choice happens to be. And don't forget to subscribe to make sure that you never miss an episode.